You know that feeling when you walk into church and your heart stays cold? When the prayers leave your mouth but never touch your soul? When you go through every motion of faith but somewhere deep down, you know something died? Saint Teresa of Avila lived that exact death for 20 years. 20 years inside a convent. 20 years wearing the habit. 20 years calling herself a nun while her soul rotted from the inside. She saw what happens when faith survives, but love grows weak. And what she witnessed changed everything we understand about the soul. Born Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada in 1515 in the Spanish city of Avila, she entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in November of 1536 at age 21. Her father did not want her to go. She went anyway. The convent held 180 women. Some had servants. Many kept pets. Most hosted visitors for hours every day in the parlor. The rule was there, but nobody followed it. The door swung open. The world walked in. And Teresa walked right out into it. For nearly 2 decades, she lived what she would later call a life of lukewarmness. Not murder, not adultery, not theft, just small things. Conversations that went nowhere. Friendships that fed vanity. Hours in the parlor laughing with guests while prayer time slipped away. She confessed everything, even the smallest faults, every venial sin. But her confessors told her those things were nothing. One priest said what was a venial sin was not a sin at all. Another said what was a mortal sin was only venial. They meant well, they knew no better, and Teresa believed them. She wrote later that this advice destroyed her. As for venial sins, I paid little attention, and that is what destroyed me. If you value deeply researched stories about saints like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. Also comment from which city you are hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from Teresa's own autobiography, The Book of Her Life, translated by Kieran Kavanagh and Otilio Rodriguez of the Institute of Carmelite Studies, along with historical accounts from the life of Saint Teresa written by herself and documented in the Christian Classics Ethereal Library archives. These are not popular summaries. These are primary source documents, the words Teresa wrote with her own hand under obedience to her confessors. Now back to the information. During those years, Teresa experienced something terrifying. She began to lose the ability to pray. At first she enjoyed prayer. She felt consolation. She felt God. But slowly, over months and years, that feeling vanished. Her soul grew distracted by vanities. She felt ashamed to approach God. The shame made her avoid prayer. The avoidance made the shame worse. She fell into a cycle that nearly killed her. In August of 1538, when she was 23 years old, Teresa collapsed. Her illness struck so suddenly that within hours she lay unconscious. For 4 days she remained insensible. They gave her the last rites. They dug her grave at the monastery. The Carmelite friars sang the Requiem Mass. Everyone believed she was dead. Wax from the funeral candles dripped onto her eyelids. Her father, devastated that he had refused to let her go to confession when she asked, could only weep. Years later, the Dominican priest Fray Bañez said in a sermon that Teresa told him she saw hell during those 4 days. Not symbolically, not in a dream. She saw it. She understood that her salvation hung by a thread. If she had died in that moment with her soul in the state it was, she would have fallen. But God raised her up. She recovered, and she went right back to the same life. She resumed mental prayer on the advice of a Dominican confessor, Father Vicente Barron. He told her to pray and never abandon it. She obeyed. But she did not cut off the occasions of sin. She kept the friendships. She kept the hours in the parlor. She kept the vanities. Her life became a torture. On one side, God called. On the other, the world pulled. She writes, "My life became most wretched because I learned in prayer more and more of my faults. This went on for 17 more years. 17 years of knowing she was failing. 17 years of confessing but not changing. 17 years of feeling like a hypocrite every time she knelt." She called it the most fearful delusion Satan could plunge her into, abandoning prayer under the pretense of humility, thinking herself too wicked to approach God, thinking she needed to be free from sin first before returning to serious prayer. She never committed a mortal sin during this time. Her confessors found no fault with her. By outward appearances, she was a distinguished lady, witty and charming. People admired her, but inside she was dying. Then came Lent of 1554. Teresa was 39 years old. Someone had left a statue in the oratory. A small bust. Exe homo, behold the man. It showed Christ bound, scourged, covered in wounds. Teresa had seen images of the crucifixion 1,000 times, but that day, something broke. She looked at the statue and understood, really understood. Those wounds were for her. That suffering was because of her. All the years of comfortable sin, all the hours wasted, all the little compromises she told herself did not matter. They mattered. Every single one. Her heart shattered. She fell to her knees weeping. She begged Christ to strengthen her once and for all so that she would never offend him again. That moment changed everything. She later called it her second conversion. Shortly after, someone gave her a copy of the Confessions of St. Augustine. She devoured it. Augustine had been a sinner, a man who lived for pleasure and the world, and God transformed him into a saint. If Augustine could change, maybe she could too. Over the next few years, Teresa's prayer life exploded. She experienced locutions, raptures, visions. At times, the sisters saw her levitate off the ground during Mass. The gifts terrified her. She thought they came from the devil. She consulted priests. Some told her she was deluded. Others said Satan was deceiving her. For years, she lived in fear that everything she experienced was demonic. But then came the vision that would define the rest of her life. One day, while in prayer, Teresa suddenly found herself plunged into what seemed to be hell itself. She did not know how it happened. One moment she was praying. The next, she was there. The entrance looked like a very long, narrow passage, like a furnace, low, dark, confined. The ground was saturated with water that looked like filthy mud, sending forth a pestilential odor. It was covered with loathsome vermin. At the end was a hollow place, scooped out of the wall, like a cupboard, and she found herself placed there in close confinement. But the physical horror was nothing compared to what she felt. She experienced a fire in her soul that she could not describe. Her bodily sufferings were unendurable, worse than anything she had suffered on earth. The doctor said she had endured the worst pains possible during her paralysis. Those pains were nothing compared to this, and she knew they would never end. No intermission, no relief, not for a moment, not for eternity. She did not see who tormented her, but she felt herself on fire and torn to pieces. The worst part was the interior fire and despair, an oppression, a suffocation, an affliction so deeply felt, accompanied by such hopeless and distressing misery that she could not put it into words. She could neither sit nor lie down. There was no room. She was placed in a hole in the wall, and the walls hemmed her in on every side. She could not breathe. There was no light. Everything was thick darkness. She understood in that moment that this was the place the devils had prepared for her, the place she had merited by her sins. Not her mortal sins. She had none. But her venial sins, her lukewarmness, her years of comfortable compromise. The vision lasted only a moment. But 6 years later, when she wrote about it, her body still grew cold with fear. The terror was still on her. She said even if she lived for many years, she believed it would be impossible to forget. That vision filled her with immense distress at the sight of so many lost souls. It gave her vehement desires for the salvation of souls. She said she would willingly endure many deaths to save even one soul from those overwhelming torments. She began to understand something most people never see. The danger is not always in the big sins. The danger is in the slow death, the comfortable sin. The thing you tell yourself does not matter because it is small. Teresa wrote extensively about this in her works. She made a critical distinction. There are venial sins you commit inadvertently, sins of weakness, sins of surprise, sins you regret immediately. Those are part of human weakness. Even the just man falls 7 times a day, Scripture says. God understands. But then there are the venial sins you choose deliberately. The ones where you say to God, I know you see this. I know you do not want it. I understand this is wrong. But I want to follow my whim and appetite more than your will. Teresa said it clearly. That kind of sin is not little. It is serious. Very serious. She described what deliberate venial sin looks like. You know a certain conversation leads to gossip, but you engage anyway. You know the friendship feeds your vanity, but you keep it. You know the entertainment wastes time you should give to prayer, but you watch. You understand, and you choose it anyway. She saw this pattern everywhere in the convent. Nuns who thought themselves holy because they avoided mortal sin, but they lived in a constant state of spiritual mediocrity. They went to Mass, they said the prayers, they wore the habit, but their hearts were elsewhere. They kept one foot in God's kingdom and the other in the world. Teresa called this the second mansion in her work, The Interior Castle. Souls who have begun to pray but still commit deliberate venial sins. They have made progress. They have had a conversion. But they do not yet have the determination to stop choosing sin. They say they want holiness, but when the moment comes to choose, they pick comfort. These souls suffer greatly. They know they should be living totally for God, and they are not. Sin brings them sorrow, but not enough sorrow to stop. They hate the struggle. They want consolations in prayer to help them advance more quickly. But Teresa warns them, God wants them to learn perseverance and virtue. Consolations will not come until they make the hard choice. Cut off the occasions of sin, give up the comfortable compromises, choose God completely. She knew this from experience. For 17 years after her father died in 1544 or 1545, she lived in this exact state. She prayed. She experienced mystical graces. But she would not give up the friendships and conversations that distracted her. She would not stop the hours in the parlor. She writes about this with brutal honesty. She says she deceived herself and others by repeating what her permissive confessors told her. She spread the spiritual poison they gave her. The turning point came when she finally consulted learned men who told her the truth. Priests of the Society of Jesus, the newly formed Jesuit order, came to Avila in 1554. At first, Teresa did not think herself fit to speak to them, but through the encouragement of friends, she met with young Jesuit confessors like Diego de Cetina and Juan de Pradanos. They believed her mystical experiences came from God. They guided her with wisdom. Then, in 1554 or 1555, she met Francisco de Borja. Before becoming a Jesuit, Borja had been the fourth Duke of Gandia, one of the most powerful men in Spain. While conveying the body of Queen Isabel of Portugal for burial, Borja had a spiritual conversion. After his wife died, he entered the Jesuit order. By the time Teresa met him, he was a man of immense spiritual authority. He assured her that her experiences came from God. His endorsement gave her credibility among other learned priests. With proper spiritual direction, Teresa began to make real progress. She started to understand what she had missed for 2 decades. The difference between knowing about God and actually surrendering to Him. The difference between praying words and letting prayer transform you. The difference between avoiding mortal sin and actually pursuing holiness. She realized that her half-instructed confessors had done her soul great harm. They certainly did not wish to deceive her, but they knew no better. Of something which was a venial sin, they said it was no sin. Out of a very grave mortal sin, they made a venial sin. This harmed her so much that she felt compelled to warn others. In 1562, at age 47, Teresa founded her first Reformed Carmelite convent, the Monastery of St. Joseph in Avila. It opened on August 24th. The convent was small, poor, only a handful of women. They followed the original Carmelite rule with absolute strictness. No servants, no pets, no hours in the parlor with visitors, no comfortable compromises. Just prayer, work, penance, and love. The contrast with the convent of the Incarnation, where Teresa had spent 27 years, could not have been starker. The Incarnation held 180 nuns living in relative comfort. St. Joseph held 13, living in radical poverty. The Incarnation allowed constant interaction with the outside world. St. Joseph enforced strict enclosure. The Incarnation represented the lukewarm, worldly religious life that nearly destroyed Teresa. St. Joseph represented what she had learned through suffering. That holiness requires total commitment. Between 1562 and her death in 1582, Teresa founded 16 more Reformed Carmelite convents throughout Spain. She traveled thousands of miles in rough wooden carts over terrible roads. She faced opposition from church authorities. She endured investigations by the Inquisition. She suffered constant illness. She wrote 4 major works of mystical theology under obedience to her confessors. In The Way of Perfection, written for the nuns of St. Joseph, she devoted entire chapters to avoiding deliberate venial sin. She wrote, "Keep this in mind, for it is very important advice. Do not neglect it until you find you have such a fixed determination not to offend the Lord that you would rather lose 1,000 lives than commit one mortal sin." She clarified what she meant. Sins committed knowingly, deliberately, with full awareness. The moment when you know something is wrong and you do it anyway because you want to follow your own will more than God's will. She said, if we commit a sin in this way, however slight, the offense is not small but very, very great. She knew the cost. She lived it. 20 years of her life wasted. 20 years she could have spent in deep union with God, spent instead in comfortable mediocrity. 20 years of slowly dying inside while looking alive outside. The vision of hell showed her what the path leads to, not because God is cruel, but because sin, even small sin, separates the soul from God, and separation from God is hell. The fire she felt was not literal flames. It was the agony of a soul that realizes too late what it has lost. A soul that finally understands it was made for infinite joy and chose finite pleasure instead. A soul that sees clearly for the first time that every small compromise mattered. Every moment wasted mattered. Every deliberate choice against God's will mattered. And now there's no going back, no second chance, no time to change. Just the crushing weight of eternal regret. Teresa lived the rest of her life with that vision burned into her memory. She said the terror never left her. Even decades later, when she thought about it, her body grew cold. But that terror was a grace. It saved her. It drove her to holiness. It made her willing to endure any suffering, any humiliation, any hardship, if it meant saving souls from that fate. When she experienced mystical graces later in life, visions of Christ, visions of the Trinity dwelling within her, she understood they were not rewards for being good. They were God's mercy shown to a soul that had wasted decades and finally turned back. A soul that had been lukewarm and learned the hard way what lukewarmness costs. She wrote about this extensively. In The Interior Castle, completed in 1577 when she was 62 years old, she described 7 stages of spiritual growth, 7 mansions within the soul. The first 3 mansions represent souls still fighting against deliberate sin. The last 4 represent souls who have surrendered completely and entered into mystical union with God. But the key transition happens between the third and fourth mansion. That is where souls make the definitive choice. Am I going to keep choosing comfortable compromise, or am I going to give everything to God? Most souls never make it past the third mansion. They plateau. They settle. They think avoiding mortal sin is enough. Teresa said it is not enough. She said souls in the third mansion have what she called an aversion to mortal and venial sin. They do good works. They pray regularly. They look holy from the outside. But they have not yet learned to avoid the occasions of deliberate venial sin. They still hold back. They still want one foot in the world. And that holding back prevents them from going deeper. God will not force himself on a soul that does not want him completely. He waits. He invites. He offers grace. But he will not override the will. Teresa knew this because she lived it. For nearly 2 decades, she experienced the call to go deeper. She felt it in prayer. She felt it when her confessors urged her to abandon the worldly friendships. She felt it when illness nearly killed her. She felt it when her father died. Every time she hesitated. Every time she held back. Until finally, at 39, she broke. The statue of Exe Homo did not show her anything new. She had known all along that Christ suffered for her. She had known her sins offended him. She had known she should change. But knowing and choosing are different things. That day, for the first time, she chose. Completely, without reservation. She gave up the comfortable compromises. She cut off the occasions of sin. She said yes to God without keeping anything back. And the transformation was immediate. Within months, she began experiencing deep mystical prayer, locutions, raptures, visions. Not because she earned them, but because she finally stopped blocking them. She removed the obstacles. She opened the door fully. And God, who had been waiting for 20 years, rushed in. She spent the rest of her life trying to help others avoid the mistakes she made. She founded 17 convents to create environments where souls could pursue holiness without the constant pull of worldliness. She wrote detailed spiritual guides to explain the path of prayer and the dangers along the way. She trained spiritual directors, both men and women, to guide souls properly. She corresponded with hundreds of people, answering their questions, correcting their errors, encouraging their progress. In 1568, she met John of the Cross, aged 26. Together, they reformed the male Carmelite order. John became one of the greatest mystical theologians in church history. Her final years were filled with suffering. In October of 1582, she collapsed at Alba de Tormes. For 11 days, she lay dying. On October 15th, at 9 in the evening, she died. Her last words were, "At last, O Lord, I am a daughter of the Church." She was canonized in 1622. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a doctor of the Church, the first woman to receive that title. Only 40 people in 2,000 years of church history have been named doctors. You cannot coast into heaven. You cannot sit in the comfortable middle, avoiding mortal sin but tolerating small compromises, and expect to grow in holiness. You have to choose. Completely. Teresa forgot for 20 years. She tasted God's presence as a young nun, but she let it slip away because the cost seemed too high. Until she saw hell. Until she understood what she was trading infinite joy for. A few hours of pleasant conversation, a little admiration. The comfort of not standing out. She spent 43 years after her conversion trying to save others from the same mistake. She wrote that if people understood what awaited lukewarm souls, they would give 1,000 lives to avoid even one deliberate venial sin. When faith survives but love grows weak, the soul does not die quickly. It dies slowly. So slowly, you do not notice. You keep going to Mass. You keep saying prayers. You keep checking boxes. But something inside hollows out. The joy fades. Consolation disappears. Prayer becomes duty instead of delight. God wants you close to him. He designed you for union with him. The reason you do not feel it is not because God withdrew. It is because you did. You chose comfortable sin. You chose small compromise. You chose your will over his. And every time you made that choice, you built another brick in the wall. But the wall can come down. That is the hope. Teresa proved it. At 39, after 20 years of lukewarm religious life, she turned completely. God gave her 43 years of deep mystical union, 43 years of experiencing his presence so intensely that at times she could not bear it, 43 years of hearing his voice, seeing his face, feeling his love so powerfully it lifted her off the ground. None of that would have happened if she had stayed comfortable, if she had kept telling herself the small sins did not matter, if she had listened to the half-instructed confessors who said venial sin was nothing. If she had believed the lie that you can love God and love the world at the same time, you cannot. Christ said it clearly. You cannot serve two masters. You will love one and hate the other. And if you try to stay in the middle, you will end up lukewarm. And God said in Revelation what he does with lukewarm souls. I will spit you out of my mouth. That is not cruelty. That is reality. God is infinite fire, infinite love, infinite life, You cannot stand in his presence while clinging to the things that separate you from him. You have to let go, completely, or you will burn, not with his love, but with the agony of being near him but unable to receive him. Teresa saw that agony in her vision of hell. She felt what it is like to be a soul created for God but separated from him forever. Created for light but trapped in darkness. Created for joy but drowning in despair. And she understood that every deliberate venial sin is a small step toward that separation. Every time you choose your will over God's, you practice for the final choice, the choice that becomes permanent at death. She wrote about a case that haunted her, a priest who lived in mortal sin for 2.5 years. The sin was so abominable she could barely speak of it. He confessed his other sins regularly, but not that one. He would say, "How can I confess so foul a sin?" He wanted to stop, but he could not bring himself to do it. Teresa heard about him and promised to pray. She got others to pray. Finally, through the intercession of holy people, the priest made a full confession. He wrote to Teresa afterward. He said he had not repeated the sin for several days, but the temptation tormented him so much it felt like he was already in hell. That is what happens when you tolerate sin for too long. It becomes a prison. You want to escape, but you cannot find the door. The habit is too strong, the pattern too entrenched. You need a miracle to break free, and sometimes the miracle does not come until you hit bottom, until the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. Teresa hit bottom when she saw hell, and when she felt the fire. When she understood what she was heading toward, that was her miracle. The mercy of seeing reality before it was too late. Most people do not get that vision. They go through life thinking everything is fine. They avoid mortal sin. They go to confession occasionally. They show up at Mass most Sundays. They think that is enough, and then they die. And they discover it was not enough, that faith without love is dead, that checking boxes is not the same as surrendering your heart, that you cannot coast into union with God. You have to fight for it every day, every moment, every small choice. Teresa fought for 43 years after her conversion, and she won. She reached the seventh mansion, complete union with God, the Trinity dwelling within her soul, Christ present to her always, joy that no suffering could touch, love that no trial could diminish. She got everything she was created for, but she got it because she paid the price. The price is renouncing deliberate sin completely, not just mortal sin, all of it. Every small compromise, every comfortable pattern that keeps you from God, every moment wasted on things that do not matter. You give it all up. You say yes to God without reservation. And then you keep saying yes when it is hard, when it hurts, when you do not feel anything. You say yes because you decided, and a decision is not a feeling. That is what Teresa learned. That is what she taught. That is why her writings still guide millions of souls 5 centuries after she wrote them. Because she did not write as someone who always got it right. She wrote as someone who got it wrong for a long time and learned the hard way how to make it right. In 1573, at a monastery foundation in Salamanca, Teresa documented something that happened during that establishment. Between 1573 and 1582, she recorded the history of 17 foundations in her Book of Foundations. In each account, she spoke of God's action in founding new monasteries. She wanted people to see how God worked through weakness, through opposition, through impossible circumstances. She did not present herself as the hero. She presented herself as the instrument, broken, flawed, but available. And God used her because she finally stopped resisting. In 1577, while serving as prioress at the Convent of the Incarnation in Avila, the same place where she spent her lukewarm years, she had another powerful vision. She saw an intellectual vision of the Trinity, all 3 persons distinctly represented in her soul. Each one spoke to her, each one promised a favor. The Father promised charity. The Son promised the ability to suffer gladly. The Holy Spirit promised enkindling love. She said from that day forward, she experienced the 3 divine persons present within her always, not as a feeling that came and went, but as a permanent reality. They were fixed within her soul. And she knew that were such divine company to continue, it would be impossible not to be recollected. That is the goal, permanent union. The divine presence so real, so constant, that nothing can disturb it. Teresa reached that, but she reached it through the narrow gate, through decades of purification, through the willingness to let God burn away everything that was not love. She wrote about it in the interior castle. The 7th mansion is not just more of the same spiritual experiences. It is a complete transformation. The soul still lives in the body, still experiences pain, still faces trials, but underneath everything, unshakable peace, Christ dwelling within. The Trinity, operating in the soul's deepest center, love so strong that suffering only increases it. But you do not get there by staying lukewarm. You do not get there by tolerating deliberate sin. You get there by making the hard choice at 39 or 29 or 19. Whenever God calls, you say yes, completely. And you never go back. Teresa never went back. From 1554 until her death in 1582, she lived with radical dedication. She endured constant illness, hostile church officials, physical pain that would have destroyed most people, betrayals by people she trusted, criticism from those who thought her reforms too extreme, years of travel over terrible roads, nights sleeping in dirty inns, days without proper food, hours of administrative work managing 17 convents. And through it all, she prayed. She wrote, she guided souls, she never stopped. Because she remembered hell, she remembered the vision, she remembered what she was saved from. And she refused to waste another moment. That is the final lesson. Once you see reality clearly, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand what is at stake, you cannot pretend anymore. Once you know that every deliberate sin matters, every wasted moment matters, every compromise matters, you have to choose. Keep living the comfortable lie or embrace the hard truth. Teresa chose truth. It cost her everything, but it gave her everything. She died poor, in pain, in a borrowed bed, but she died as a daughter of the church. She died in union with God. The grave they opened for her in 1538 remained empty. God raised her up. He gave her more years, and she spent everyone fighting to save souls from the fate she glimpsed. Not because she was naturally holy, but because she learned the hard way what holiness costs and what lukewarmness costs more. She knew what most people refuse to see. This life is not practice. It is the real thing. Every moment counts. Every choice matters. And when you die, it is over. No more chances. No more time to change. Whatever state your soul is in at death, that is what you take into eternity. If your soul has spent decades in lukewarmness, tolerating deliberate sin, choosing comfort over holiness, what then? Teresa saw the answer. She felt the fire. She experienced the crushing weight of eternal regret, and she spent the rest of her life screaming the warning, do not waste your life. Do not settle for lukewarm faith. Do not tell yourself the small sins do not matter. They matter more than you can imagine, because every small sin practiced on earth becomes a habit of the soul, and those habits do not disappear at death. They become permanent. That choice is available to everyone. No matter how many years you have wasted, no matter how entrenched the patterns, no matter how lukewarm your soul has become, God is still calling, still offering, still waiting for you to say yes completely. But you have to say it now, today, this moment, because you do not know how many moments you have left. Teresa got 28 years after her near-death experience at 23. Then she wasted 17 more. Then she got 43 years of union with God. But some people do not get that much time. Some people die next week, and wherever their soul is when they die, that is where it stays. Teresa is screaming at us across 5 centuries. Wake up. See clearly, understand what is at stake. Stop wasting your life in comfortable compromise. Stop tolerating deliberate sin because it is small. Stop choosing your will over God's will because it is easier. And start giving everything to God. Start cutting off the occasions of sin. Start taking prayer seriously. Start treating every moment as if it matters, because it does. Start living like someone who believes hell is real and heaven is real, and your choices determine which one you get. Teresa understood both sides, God's mercy and God's justice, how he pursued her for 20 years, how he waited patiently, how he gave her graces she did not deserve, but also how he allows souls to experience the consequences of their choices, how he shows them reality so they can see what they are choosing, how he will not force anyone to love him, even if refusing to love him leads to hell. In 1577, while at the Convent of the Incarnation, she had a vision of the Trinity, all 3 persons distinctly present in her soul. Each promised a favor. The Father promised charity. The Son promised the ability to suffer gladly. The Holy Spirit promised enkindling love. She said from that day forward, the 3 divine persons remained present within her always. That is the goal. Permanent union. Divine presence so real, so constant, that nothing can disturb it. But you do not get there by staying lukewarm. You get there by making the hard choice. Whenever God calls, you say yes, completely, and you never go back. Teresa never went back. From 1554 until 1582, she lived with radical dedication. She endured constant illness, hostile church officials, physical pain that would have destroyed most people, years of travel over terrible roads, nights in dirty inns, days without proper food, hours managing 17 convents. And through it all, she prayed, she wrote, she guided souls, because she remembered hell. She remembered the vision. She remembered what she was saved from. And she refused to waste another moment. Once you see reality clearly, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand what is at stake, you cannot pretend anymore. Once you know that every deliberate sin matters, you have to choose. Keep living the comfortable lie or embrace the hard truth. Her body lies at Alba de Tormes, incorrupt after 443 years. Her heart shows the mark of the transverberation. An angel pierced it with a flaming spear in a vision. The wound remains visible on her physical heart. But the greater miracle is that a woman who wasted 20 years became a doctor of the church. A soul who nearly ended in hell became a guide for millions trying to reach heaven. Her feast day is October 15th. Catholics worldwide celebrate her life each year. They read her writings. They ask for her intercession. But most miss the central lesson. She is not a saint because she was naturally holy. She is a saint because she learned that lukewarm faith leads to death, that small sins matter, that you have to choose completely, and that if you make that choice, no matter how late, God will transform you into something you never imagined possible.